my whole family, we went to church every Sunday. It was great, and everything was perfect. I mean, God was good. He was the leader of the household, and that was for the first few years of my life. And it was just great. I mean, yeah, everything was good.
My parents weren't really churchgoers. There was a lady down the road, Jeannie Robinson, who picked me up every Sunday from the time I was probably about 12 on and took me to church. It was just something that I wanted to do, I think.
I was always raised in church. Both my mother and father they always made me go, I guess. So it was kind of one of them situations where I was just young and I just had to go.
I grew up in a Christian home, but it was, at least my dad was a very new believer, young in his faith. But I grew up in the church. I grew up being around church people. I grew up being around the culture that surrounded those people. And honestly, I had no ill will towards it whatsoever. It was normal for me. It was almost a haven. I was bullied a lot when I was a kid. So there was, I guess, a safety that I found there.
In 2006, my mom became a political activist, and she started talking about this during church. And so while she was discussing her truth of this, the church disagreed with it, and so they sent her a letter saying, we need you to either stop talking about your political beliefs or stop attending. And this is hard for my mom because she had started this church, and so when they asked her to do that, I mean, it was very hard for her. And so obviously she chose to leave the church, and it was very hard on our family. And so this problem led to so many other problems in our life, because since God was the leader of the house, when we lost our church, we lost basically everything. And so it led to my parents' divorce, and it led to basically all of our lives falling apart. And so it was hard on our family.
There was a little church out in the country close to where I grew up, and that was the one where I started going. And I went there from the time I was 16 till the time I was 36. It was a really super small church. They had a sister church, and they got pastors that were students. So we would have a pastor 2, possibly 3, 4 years if they changed their major. But we had, there was always variation. I mean, there was always change within the pastors of the church. The first year of my son's life, I didn't work at all. And then when he turned 1, I started doing a state certified daycare in my home. And I did that for a little over 2 years until he could talk. I didn't want to send him to a sitter. Where I live northeast of here. It's very rural. There's not very many jobs, and there's certainly very few good paying jobs. So with my background, for me to get a sales job, I know that I'm commuting to Columbus. With my son being that small, I didn't want to do the hour commute. So I was managing the pool, which I loved because I got to take my son to work with me, and he loved that. And then I was still kind of doing part-time. I cut down hours a little bit for my friend, but I was still kind of doing both. And we were on the way to vacation Bible school, and my car was in the shop, and my pastor and her husband had picked me up for Bible school, and they had me trapped in the car. And they proceeded to lecture me on I was being irresponsible. My jobs were little kid jobs. That she had been a lifeguard in high school, and that I needed to get myself together, and I needed to go get a real job. It really did hurt me that my church wasn't supportive, especially of me trying to do what I thought was best for my son.
I guess my bad church experience started when I got older and started understanding a little more about the talks and the sermons. And I felt like a lot of churches I've been to were churches that only pointed fingers, and they were exempt from anything wrong because they went to church. My response was I could not trust church. It it was a lot of just frustration every time I had to go because I didn't believe in anything he had to say after a while. This was more toward when I was getting into high school and, like, understanding became a little easier. So the longer I stayed in church, I had just a bigger distaste for it because I felt like they would always point fingers and act exempt from sin. As far as how it affected me going through high school, I've never like went to church. In the later parts of high school, I started going back to like youth groups, and that's how I started getting to know Jesus, just through friends and the consistent love I got from other people. But I was always afraid to go back to church as a community, rather than nothing more than a small group. Still today have problems, I guess, trusting church. I'm not comfortable being committed to a church because it's kind of like I'm trying to set myself up to not get let down again after all these years of like trying to open back up to it. And it's just hard because every time I go to church, I'm just thinking like I hope these aren't the people that are like the people in my childhood. So, I mean, it's gotten a lot better, but still to this day, I don't really commit to a church.
I was probably about 10 years old. So I have a small memory, but I think a pretty deep memory of some things that just began to be a source of unrest, I guess, in my perception of what the church is and the way that it can be flawed. We went to a church service one Wednesday night, and it was weird. It was weird for me to be there on a Wednesday night, but all of the kids were kind of ushered into these different Sunday school classrooms and nurseries, and the parents and the adults went to go talk in the sanctuary for a really long time. It was like an hour and a half or something. Come to find out, there had been this hour and a half session just picking apart all of the issues that these people have been having together and with each other. Things like issues that older people were having with the things that the pastor was wearing to preach on Sunday, not standing behind the pulpit, and then the pastor also getting really caught up in defensiveness over the appointments that he'd made, and it's, I guess, haste to bring newness or expansion to the church. And there was just a whole lot of brokenness in that, and a lot of anger and a lot of bitterness and name calling. And anyway, it ended up with the pastor resigning, and not great things following after that. My parents, being new believers, were crushed by that in huge ways. They were close to that pastor, but also loyal to that church, and were almost forced into this position of having to choose sides, being told that if they stayed, they were siding with the church, but if they left, then they weren't, following what the Lord wanted or his plan for the church. But I remember that being the first time that I felt anything less than respect for the church and for the people of the church, and certainly started to get frustrated and started to get upset. I mean, I guess on one hand it didn't affect me directly, but my parents, people who I love and respect in a huge way, were hurt on a big level, and started to be really confused.
I mean, church has always been important to me. I felt that, I don't know, I feel like I'm kind of in an odd spot as far as religion. I feel, well, not religion, I wouldn't say, but I would say church. I do think that what happened at Center kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. I don't know. I really don't. I mean, I've been watching sermons on TV. I mean, because I think I still want to hear that. I still want my soul to be fed. But the other thing that's really bothering me is that my son isn't in church. And that bothers me a lot.
In 6th grade, I got invited to the youth group at Delaware Grace. And so I remember walking in the doors, and I'd never really been accepted anywhere before. And so for that long span of time, no one had ever come to me like in open arms. And so, the church I expected to be the last place that would happen. So I walked in the doors, and I remember seeing Alex, and he just saw me and was like, "I'm so happy you're here, like, hi." And it was just a wonderful thing because that has never happened before. And so it made me want to come back, and I got to see God's love through that because it had never been shown before.
I do a lot of things with Young Life as far as like leaderships and small groups with high school kids. And that's kind of been my segue into a bigger community. Because what I figured out is through that, I've been missing out on like the best types of fellowship. And just seeing a community come together that all loves Jesus, that encouragement you get from that is absolutely amazing.
Like, I completely understand that my experience with this isn't one that's localized or one that's isolated in any sense of the imagination. As I've walked with the Lord in my life, I've ran into tons of people whose problems with the gospel or problems in even finding their way to Jesus have dealt solely with stumbling over the church or stumbling over what they perceive the church to be.